Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on some deeply unsettling source material and breaking it down to see what's actually going on beneath the surface. We're launching a clinical investigation into the minds of methodical, deliberate murderers. We're talking the neuroscience, the genetics, and the psychology behind the world's most dangerous minds. It's a topic that's fascinated and frankly terrified us for generations. And we're going to look strictly at what the science tells us.
So, what makes a killer, right? It's literally the ultimate question. And we're not just talking about a one-time offender here. We're talking about someone who kills again and again with terrifying precision. Now, for centuries, society has basically leaned on this really comforting myth to answer that question. We desperately want to believe that the answer is simple, that serial killers are just fundamentally different from the rest of us. We tell ourselves they're simply inhuman. But when you actually sit down and look at the data, we really have to contrast that popular monster myth with a much, much more disturbing scientific reality. So on one side, you've got this comforting idea of inhuman monsters. But on the other side, science has actually been looking inside their brains for decades, and what they've found is that the truth is, they are almost exactly like us. Almost. The gap between a completely normal brain and a serial killer's brain is shockingly narrow, and understanding that tiny, terrifying gap is exactly what we're doing here today.
Let's move to and see how this builds as we look at the actual clinical data. This brings us right into the quiet, clinical, and honestly terrifying world of brain scans and behavioral science. Look, to truly figure out how a mind turns dangerous, we've got to look at the physical hardware of the brain itself. We need to map out where these differences actually live. And scientists have managed to isolate two highly specific regions that play a really massive role.
Okay, the first absolutely critical area is the orbital cortex. Now, neuroscientist James Fallon spent a ton of time studying the brain scans of convicted murderers, and he noticed this stark, repeating pattern. Basically, among serial killers, there is significantly reduced activity in the orbital cortex. And why does that matter? Well, this is the exact area of your brain that handles impulse control. It's your braking system. When you get a sudden, aggressive urge, a healthy orbital cortex steps right in and says, nope, we are definitely not going to do that. But in a serial killer, those brakes are fundamentally worn down, or literally missing entirely.
Then we have the second critical area, the amygdala. You've probably heard of it. It's the brain's emotional center. It processes fear, empathy, and remorse. And Fallon's research showed dramatically reduced activity in the amygdala of convicted murderers, too. I mean, just think about what that actually means in the real world. Without a properly functioning amygdala, the normal emotional guardrails that keep us from hurting people, the empathy we feel when someone's in pain, the intense remorse we feel when we mess up, they're just completely stripped away. You've essentially got a brain with no brakes and absolutely no emotional compass.
But here is where the clinical data takes a twist, right out of a Hollywood thriller. So James Fallon is reviewing this massive stack of serial killer brain scans on his desk, right? And he notices one specific scan that perfectly matches the terrifying pattern we literally just talked about. No brakes, no emotional guardrails. It was the absolute textbook scan of a highly dangerous mind. He checks the label to see which convicted murderer it belonged to. And you guys, no way. It was his own brain scan. He had inadvertently slipped his own scan into the pile.
Now, what's really interesting about this is it immediately forces us to ask a really profound question. As Fallon himself wondered, if the brain is the same, why isn't the behavior? I mean, Fallon's a highly successful, nonviolent neuroscientist, yet he possesses the exact same neurological hardware as the absolute worst predators he studies. This haunting question proves that we can't just look at the physical brain. There has to be more to the equation, right? We've got to look at the underlying code.
And that brings us straight to genetics. Back in 1993, a researcher named Han Brunner made a huge breakthrough. He identified a specific genetic mutation in a gene called MAOA. Brunner found this mutation running through multiple violent men within one specific Dutch family. And this MAOA mutation is directly linked to impulsive aggression. Okay, so now we have the brain structure, and we have an actual genetic code for violence. But, and this is a big but, the science shows that having this gene alone doesn't just automatically turn someone violent.
Which leads us to one of the most chilling but honestly clarifying statements in criminal psychology. The gene loads the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. It perfectly establishes a clear recipe for a dangerous mind. Biological and genetic vulnerability, that's just the first ingredient. For elevated aggression and truly predatory violence to actually manifest, those biological factors have to be combined with environmental triggers. Specifically, the individuals carrying that MAOA mutation only showed violent behavior if they also experienced severe childhood trauma. To truly understand how these traits play out in society, we really need to look at the psychopathy spectrum. Because psychopathy isn't just a simple switch that's flipped on or off. It's a personality profile, and it exists in varying degrees. And the numbers here are completely fascinating. Approximately 1% of the general population scores highly on psychopathy measures. Let that sink in. That means these dangerous traits, this biological hardware we've been talking about, are walking around among us every single day.
But I want you to contrast that 1% with this number, 25%. Up to a quarter of all prison populations score highly on those exact same psychopathy measures. The stark, undeniable difference between those two numbers shows exactly what happens when the environment actually pulls the trigger on those biological traits. But it makes you wonder, what exactly are those traits, and why do they only send some people to prison?
Well, this spectrum is incredibly complex. The defining traits are fearlessness, emotional detachment, and ruthless focus. If you combine those traits with childhood trauma, you get a highly methodical, cold-blooded killer. And this brilliantly illustrates how if you take those exact same traits, fearlessness, detachment, ruthless focus, and put them in a completely stable environment, they can actually make someone extraordinarily successful. Think about it. You absolutely need emotional detachment and ruthless focus to be a top-tier surgeon operating under intense pressure. You definitely need fearlessness in high-stakes corporate law or cutthroat business. In fact, Dr. Robert Hare, he's the world's leading researcher on psychopathy, made this deeply unsettling observation. He basically said, if I had to go looking for psychopaths, I wouldn't start in prisons. I'd start on Wall Street. Man, that really drives home just how uncomfortably close to home these psychological profiles really are, doesn't it? The machinery of a ruthless CEO and a ruthless killer might literally be identical. It's just the environment that dictates exactly how that machinery gets used.
So, how on earth do we spot when the environment is actively shaping this machinery toward violence? Well, we have to shift from the laboratory out into the field. FBI profilers have literally spent decades tracking the dramatic true crime patterns of violent offenders to see if there are early environmental warning signs. Basically, they wanted to know if they could watch the environment pulling the trigger in real time. And well, they found a very distinct pattern.
The FBI identifies something known as the McDonald Triad. These are 3 highly specific childhood behaviors that serve as massive warning signs in violent offenders. We're talking about bedwetting beyond a normal age, fire starting, and animal cruelty. When profilers see these 3 behaviors clustering together in a single child, they don't just see a bad kid. They recognize it as a desperate psychological response to severe environmental stress. It's a massive, glaring red flag for future violent behavior.
Because when you start looking across the case files of the most notorious offenders, guys like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, the exact same pattern just repeats itself over and over and over again. And the singular, consistent factor across almost all serious serial killer cases is childhood trauma, almost without exception. Now, science absolutely does not present this as an excuse for their horrific crimes. Not at all. But it does present it as clinical evidence that predatory violence rarely, if ever, just emerges out of nowhere.
Which actually brings us right back to the crazy anomaly of neuroscientist James Fallon. How did this guy have the actual brain of a killer, but end up becoming a respected, successful scientist? Well, Fallon had the biological vulnerability, right? The broken orbital cortex, the inactive amygdala, but, as he himself concluded, he just got lucky. He was raised in a highly stable, incredibly loving family. There was 0 trauma. Because his environment was so safe, those profound biological vulnerabilities were simply never activated.
Now look, it is incredibly important to be humble about what science can and cannot do here. Science absolutely cannot reliably predict who is going to become a serial killer. The vast, vast majority of people with psychopathic brain profiles never commit an act of violence, and the vast majority of people who experience terrible childhood trauma never harm a fly. But what this science has done is force us to fundamentally shift our questioning. We've got to stop asking, what kind of monster is this? And start asking, what kind of world produces this? So the crucial point is this: the brain is not destiny. Serial killers aren't just supernatural monsters existing totally beyond our understanding. They are human beings, fundamentally shaped by biology and by experience, in whom something went catastrophically and irreparably wrong. And look, understanding the stark mechanics of how these killers are shaped, it doesn't make their crimes any less horrific. But if we can truly understand exactly how the gun is loaded and exactly how the trigger gets pulled, might that be the absolute best way we have to stop the next one before it even starts?